It was an Iranian military attack that was made for TV. So was the Israeli response. But what will all this lead to, apart from taking the eyes of the world off of Gaza? Terminology matters. The New York Times knows it. And the language it is using on Gaza is a story unto itself. Plus, believers in Kenya led to their graves by a televangelist. Where were the regulators? It's been a week now since more than 300 Iranian missiles and drones were launched Israel's way. But despite the initial alarm, the rush to the bomb shelters, the doomsday scenarios, an all-out regional war has failed to materialize. Instead, Israel conducted a limited counterattack on Friday on military targets in Isfahan, which was similar to Iran's strategic approach. The vast majority of those Iranian projectiles were shot down by Israel or its allies. The damage was minimal, 0 Israeli fatalities, an outcome that military experts concluded was by design. Israel's response also had more to do with spectacle than substance, because the Netanyahu government had the optics to consider. Don't act and risk losing face or retaliate when its primary backer, the U.S., had called for restraint, at least publicly. Whatever happens next, Iran's attack and the way it has been characterized in the Western media may have garnered Israel some more support abroad, which could prove crucial in this battle of perceptions as Israeli forces continue to slaughter Palestinians in Gaza.
Any kind of a battle between Iran and Israel is not only a battle between two armed militaries or two sets of government officials issuing competing or conflicting statements. It's also a battle of nerves, a battle for information superiority, for international support and sympathy.
When our news feeds lit up on that night with images of military fireworks in the skies over Israel, there was reason to fear the worst. Depending on who then spun the story, Iran's airborne assault was either a reckless act of aggression that risked triggering a wider war.
Firing 110 ballistic missiles is a dangerous escalation. If those
or a deliberate act of restraint.
وعده صادق اقدامی محدود بود نه اقدامی فراگیر و گسترده.
It proved to be a highly performative exercise on Tehran's part that resulted in no Israeli fatalities, had more to do with messaging than anything else, and had to leave warmongers disappointed.
From the Iranian perspective, it was a chance to put on a spectacle, to really get the headlines and show that they engage in unprecedented direct action against Israel. But it was mainly a message because we didn't have the mass casualties. On Israel's part, it was an opportunity to put out the message that it was able to defend itself. 99% of missiles were shot down. So from both sides, they could claim victory.
Not only the Iranian strike was well telegraphed in advance, it was clearly coordinated in a fashion that Israel and its allies could defend effectively. So the point was not destruction. The point was a political message that the Iranians were sending to try to re-establish deterrence against Israel.
Israel's response to Iran's attack took 6 days to happen. It too was limited, largely symbolic, targeting an airbase near Isfahan, not the city itself nor the nuclear plant nearby. That failed to satisfy Israeli hardliners, like Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who flat out called it lame, while Israel's cheerleaders, like the British Prime Minister, offered their approval.
We have condemned Iran's reckless and dangerous barrage of missiles against Israel on Saturday, and Israel absolutely has the right to self-defense.
Which was consistent with what had come out of the White House and many Western governments in the aftermath of Iran's initial attack, that the Islamic Republic was the aggressor.
So let's be straight. Given the scale of this attack, Iran's intent was clearly to cause significant destruction and casualties.
The U.S. called Iran's actions unprecedented, even though they had been preceded by Israel's bombing of an Iranian consular building in the Syrian capital, Damascus, on April 1st, that killed 2 Iranian generals, among others. It was a position the UK also took, that when challenged, proved to be a hard sell.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And Iran would say that that's what they did?
Well,
even those well aware Iran has influence beyond its borders and uses its embassies and consulates as cover when arming its regional allies, have said the Israeli strike in Damascus was dangerously provocative.
Here I must be very, very critical about Israel. It was one of those adventures that Israel is committing only because it is possible. There was hardly a debate about the consequences, about the price, about the day after. I mean, Israel explained it with damaging the military capability of Iran, or Hezbollah, or Hamas.
אנחנו פועלים בכל מקום, בכל יום, כדי למנוע את ההתעצמות של האויבים שלנו.
What is this rubbish? By the end of the day, it's about showing off the Israeli macho, the Israeli James Bond. Deterrence will never be achieved through assassinations, and capabilities are not damaged by those assassinations. So we are left only with the need to show off.
Iran is often portrayed in Western media as a malign actor. There is very rarely a recognition that, like most other states, Iran has legitimate security concerns and at times has responded with restraint. Over the past few months, Israel had killed multiple senior Iranian military officials in Syria. Israel has conducted covert operations against Iranian nuclear facilities, against Iranian infrastructure, killed Iranian scientists, Iranian commanders on Iranian soil. And so this is not a one-sided fight, and you rarely see the Western media trying to strike a balance in distributing or allocating blame for the current situation.
So what was really behind Iran's theatrical but ultimately limited act of war? The Iranian military could have launched more of its drones and missiles through one of its proxies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, right next door to Israel. Instead, it not only sent almost all of them from Iran, it broadcasted some of those launches, giving the Israelis and their American and British allies 3 hours to prepare for them and ultimately take most of the missiles down. But like the Netanyahu government in Israel, the leaders of the Islamic Republic have been playing to a domestic audience. The drones and missiles, most of which the Iranians knew would never land, were the vehicles for that.
Iran at the moment is in a quite fragile state internally. There has been for the last 2 or 3 years quite a lot of protest against the authoritarian actions of the regime. And so the regime in Iran is very aware of the ways in which getting embroiled in another war would actually endanger its own stability. So there is a very major calculation about its own vulnerabilities in the ways in which Iran has responded.
There are 2 narratives that are going on in Iran right now. One is that this was a historic strike, and parts of the Iranian population appeared receptive to it, particularly in the aftermath of the Syria bombing. At the same time, most Iranians are not in favor of war. Their focus is on their daily lives, the economic conditions, and there's been a renewed crackdown on the Islamic headscarf in Iran, the mandatory nature of it, and that could very much undermine any rallying around the flag effect from any conflict with Israel.
3 days after Iran launched its quasi-attack on Israel, this story of performative warfare and shadow diplomacy descended into the absurd when reports surfaced that the U.S. had contacted the Islamic Republic asking it to allow Israel to conduct a symbolic counterattack to quote-unquote save face. 72 hours later, Israel hit the base near Isfahan.
Israel's interceptors protected Jerusalem's sacred Islamic sites. Iran?
Equally absurd was this YouTube ad posted online by the Netanyahu government, trumpeting the interception of Iran's missiles and declaring that Israel, which has spent 6 months obliterating Gaza and its Muslim population, had acted to protect some of Islam's holiest sites.
It is so ridiculous. I mean, really, propaganda can go as far as it wishes, but Israel did not protect the holy places, and Iran didn't target the holy places. Israel is violating severely for decades the freedom of worship of Muslims, mainly Palestinians, to get there when it's needed. But the Iran attack won a lot of sympathy back to Israel. Not to Netanyahu so much, but to Israel. And the problem is that Israel is going to lose all the sympathy if Israel will go for an attack, as it seems now.
As it eventually did, 6 days later. Of greater value to Israel than any sympathy Iran's attack may have produced is the distraction it created, away from the horrific stories still coming out of Gaza, of so many more Palestinian bodies getting unearthed, including from the hospital, Al-Shifa, corpses found with IV tubes still attached. Images of 7 school children slaughtered on a playground. War crimes that would have got far more coverage than they did if news outlets were not transfixed by this new Iran angle. A telegenic story that, for all of the fireworks, is not what it appeared to be. For the past 6 months, the New York Times' coverage of Israel's post-October 7th assault on Gaza has taken a pummeling from critics both inside and outside the paper. Meenakshi Ravi is here with the latest example of that.
A report this past week by the investigative news site The Intercept revealed a memo that editors at the Times sent to staff back in November and which has been regularly updated since. The memo is effectively a style guide for the coverage of Israel's post-October 7th assault on Gaza. There's nothing unusual about such style guides. It's standard practice across news organizations. What makes this memo controversial is some of the terminology it warns the paper's journalists against using. Times reporters should, the guidance says, avoid using the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land which Israel's military is, according to international law, occupying. As one Times source interviewed by The Intercept put it, that amounts to, quote, taking the occupation out of the coverage when it is, in fact, the actual core of the conflict. The memo also instructs staff to steer clear of the term refugee camps for parts of Gaza that are home to Palestinians displaced during previous wars. These are people who are refugees. These terms, occupied territories and refugee camps, are official language used by the United Nations and international NGOs. It's unusual for news organizations to restrict use of this terminology. In its response to The Intercept's report, a Times spokesperson said that issuing guidance like this is to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance in how we cover the news. Back in February, another Intercept investigation into a widely discredited Times report about the, quote, weaponization of rape by Hamas on October 7th revealed considerable dissent in the Times' newsroom over the paper's Gaza coverage. Clearly, that discontent is still brewing and still leaking out to The Intercept.
Thanks, Meena. Last year, we aired a disturbing story out of Kenya about the dangers of religious broadcasting, televangelism, and how difficult that content can be to regulate. We are rebroadcasting it now because the televangelist at the heart of the story, Paul Mackenzie, has been formally charged with the murder of 191 people. Mackenzie allegedly led those victims, his followers, to their deaths by telling them the world was coming to an end. Among the questions being asked in the aftermath, should the authorities, Kenya's media regulators, have done more to stop Mackenzie's doomsday preachings from being broadcast? And if so, how would that square with the right constitutionally protected in Kenya to freedom of speech and religion? Those are questions that require urgent answers because televangelism is on the rise in Kenya, where 85% of the population is Christian. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from the Kenyan coast on the tragedy that has come to be known as the Shakahola massacre.
We've just left Malindi, a coastal town in eastern Kenya, and are heading inland to the Shakahola forest. In March, news broke that a woman had killed her children here in order to please God. When the story broke, Joseph Yeri was one of the first journalists at the scene.
We were first called here by the police. We were informed that there were two bodies of children buried inside here. Instead, we found bodies all over, mass graves all over.
To date, more than 350 bodies and counting have been exhumed. They were all led to the forest by a televangelist named Paul Mackenzie. He is thought to have told them that the world was ending and that in order to reach God, they would have to starve themselves to death. First children, then women, then men. Mackenzie said he would follow, but he never did. So tell me about Paul Mackenzie. What do we know about him?
Initially, he was a taxi driver in Malindi until he formed his own ministry now called Good News International Ministries. That church, according to the believers who first went in, was just a good church. Miracles happened until 2015. Now, when he became a televangelist, a pastor, the message started changing. He started introducing the issue to do with prophecies, and all these prophecies were broadcasted live on television.
Tell me about Mackenzie's followers, those that followed him into this forest.
They came from far and wide because Mackenzie had followers all over.
So presumably many of those people would never have heard of Paul Mackenzie were it not for his TV channel.
Correct.
There's still an estimated 600 of Paul Mackenzie's followers who are still missing in Shakahola forest. One of them is a woman named Pamela Mukulasinga. She's from Bungoma. It's a county in northwest Kenya, the opposite end of the country, nearly 1,000 kilometers from here. We've managed to find her son. He's living in Nairobi, so I'm off to the capital to meet him. Televangelism is the use of media to communicate Christianity. The televangelists in Kenya often claim that they can perform miracles,
I stand against those powers now.
deliver spiritual healing, and guarantee prosperity, typically in the exchange for donations, which have made some televangelists very wealthy and influential. For some viewers, often the most vulnerable, the promise being directly into their homes of divine intervention by these pastors proves irresistible.
Paul Mackenzie is what we would refer to as a charismatic authority.
Tutakaa na Mungu wetu milele na milele, tupumzike taabu ya mateso ya dunia hii.
Because in order to be a televangelist, in order to hold the attention of an audience, no matter how big or small, you have to have a particular kind of charisma.
Comparing to other African televangelists, you can tell that the rest of the African televangelists tend to go the prosperity way, and Paul Mackenzie goes the mystical way.
Bwana akaniuliza, unajua ni kwa nini siku ya leo ndo mbona maiti hawafufuki kama nilivyofufua?
When mystery kicks in, then somebody is believed to have information or news or power that other people don't have. And so that occultic, mystical element is what really endeared him to a lot of people.
Pamela Mukalasinga's son, Rogers Shibuse, says that she would spend her days watching Mackenzie's Times TV channel and was captivated by his sermons that promised spiritual healing. She thought he could help her daughter, who was suffering from mental health issues. This time last year, Shibuse's mother, his sister, and her 3-year-old daughter left home to join the televangelist.
Okay, mostly kitu ilifanya madhe.
The main reason my mother followed Mackenzie's preaching was my elder sister's illness. During his TV sermons, Mackenzie would often use the Bible and a specific oil to heal people, so my mother thought he might be able to help my sister. That was her main motivation. If it wasn't for his TV station, my mother never would have heard of someone like Mackenzie.
When religion comes under the agency of media, then media transforms that religion. And so perhaps for people like Paul Mackenzie, media tended to give them some kind of reputation and credibility.
Sifurahiki kazi inayoendelea Ruiru tangu nimewaacha. Je, Mungu?
Paul Mackenzie's message would have first started out as what we would consider an instance of religious diversity, right? Because it doesn't just start off as an end of times. We then see it moving into a space of deviance.
Education is evil.
And then later on we see it moving into a space of danger.
Lakini shetani amedhihirika katika roho ya uke zaidi. Hallelujah.
Now, it's difficult to predict what the progression will be, because not all diverse iterations of a mainstream religion will become deviant, and not all deviant iterations of a mainstream religion will become dangerous, but sometimes they do.
The question now is, at what point should the Kenyan authorities have intervened? And could they have done so while upholding Mackenzie's constitutional right to freedom of thought and religion? The Communications Authority is the body responsible for regulating broadcast media in the country. This past April, it suspended Mackenzie's TV channel, but only after the Shakahola story had broken. And even then, it was mostly for administrative non-compliance. Little of the content it reviewed broke the rules. I asked the Director General how his organization monitors this kind of content.
We use a system that logs the information. But when you have 320 TV stations, for you to make sense of that content, the technology we have is that somebody has to sit down and listen through or watch to be able to conclude the nature of that particular content. That's why the complaint mechanism is much better. If somebody sees something unbecoming, then they're able to report, then we can now go specifically to track down that specific broadcaster.
The problem I see with that mechanism is that you are relying on viewer feedback, but often the viewers of these channels are the people that are being radicalized. Yes. Yeah. Do you not see that as an issue in the system?
It's really a problem, but then our responsibility is not to regulate content of theological nature unless it's so obvious on the face of it. Content that we looked at, we did not see a direct link with the massacre.
Do you not think that, yes, there may not be a direct link to Shakahola, but that problematic content needs the miracles and the prosperity preachings.
Yeah.
Do you not think that needs to be regulated?
You know, the trouble with the issues of religion and faith is exactly that, faith. And that's why when you allow freedom of religion, is to just allow people to make sense of life in the way they see best. So the risk of going that route is that you end up being a policeman in people's conscience. But that balance has to be struck. And that's a really big challenge for us.
Paul Mackenzie is now in jail and faces multiple charges. But the media environment in which he thrived and the constitutional rights that protected him remain the same. Kenya is 85% Christian, and televangelists wield enormous influence. So politicians wanting to stay in power are unlikely to challenge the hegemony of these TV pastors and their armies of faithful followers, even if that leaves an untold number of vulnerable people at risk.
So mwezi wa tatu nikatoka hapa Nairobi nikaenda Malindi.
I left Nairobi for Malindi to search for my mother. When I got there, I found one of Mackenzie's followers who had been rescued. They told me they had seen my mother and my sister. My sister and her child had been tied up until they died and were buried. Having seen all this, my mother ran deep into the forest. I have been trying to find her ever since, but to this day, nothing.
And finally, this past week, the world's most elaborate election process got underway. Indians, and there are more than 950 million eligible voters, will be casting ballots over the next 6 weeks. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, are considered a lock to win an historic third term. Key opposition leaders are in jail. Many others have been forced into the BJP by threats of legal cases or lured in by the prospect of getting senior positions in the party. And then there is the undeniable domination of the Indian media space by Modi, from anchors on mainstream news channels to influencers on social media, even the Bollywood elite. The BJP has either convinced or coerced people into echoing the message that there is no alternative to Modi, even worth debating, let alone voting for. We'll be keeping our eyes on this story and the central role that the Indian media are playing in it, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.